Hello. Hi, Taj.
Hey, Aina, how's it going?
Good. Great to see you. So excited for this chat. Thank you for making it happen despite all the time difference and connectivity issues.
Absolutely. It is currently 11 p.m. here in the great city of Dubai for us here at COP, and the ball is still rolling. Everybody's still out and
Whew.
trying to get some work done around climate.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. So, I want to just kick this off by saying to everyone who's joining us, thank you for joining us. I cannot imagine a better kickoff to the series than having Taj actually live from COP28. So, there's going to be a little bit of a delay sometimes when I ask questions. I feel like, one of those people who's like in the newsroom and you got to wait for somebody to respond to you. That's how it feels right now. Super exciting. I'm going to introduce Taj and then I'm going to just jump into some questions. And for the folks out there, please add any questions you want into the chat and we'll do our best to answer them before the end of our time. Just a quick introduction. So my name is Aina Abiodun. I am the president and executive director of Virtulab. We are a Pacific Northwest based climate innovation, technology, and funding organization. And we have been around as an org for over 14 years. I joined the organization just roughly 6 months ago as its new executive director. And I'm working on many different exciting things, including our new work at the intersection of justice and climate, which is one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to have our guest with us today. Taj, I'll just give a quick intro and you can add anything to it that you think I might be missing. But I pulled this directly off your own bio. Um, so Taj is currently a managing director at JFF Labs. That's Job for Future. And he is having drawn on more than 25 years of experience as an investment professional. He leads a cross collaborative team focused on the intersection of climate and workforce. Um, he has a storied history in both finance and climate. As general partner of Include Venture Partners and a former senior director of investments at the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, he has built a long-standing career with expertise in the fields of fintech, media, energy, transportation, and the circular economy. Eldridge is also one of the 70 Black investors in Bevy.com, a $325 million virtual conference platform, as noted in Afrotech. So the Lacey Impact Fund, which he established, which I'm going to get into when we talk about more about funding, and the Lacey Debt Fund allowed clean tech companies to grow with diverse capital. These funds utilize an equity impact lens to encourage invested companies to have environmental, economic, and social impact, particularly on the increasing number of underrepresented voices in the clean tech industry. In addition, Taj created programs such as the Lacey Investor Talks, the Lacey Investor in Residence Program, and the Player to CEO Athlete Investor Impact Series with JP Morgan Chase. He has been named one of the 53 investors to watch in 2021 by PitchBook and 101 Black Titans in Tech while nurturing and building a team of investment advocates. He also serves on the Climate Finance Advisory Team of the Community Investment Guarantee Pool, the Executive Board of Homeboy Industries Venture Fund, the Majira Project, a Boston Consulting Group Venture Studio. And I love this, Taj, your background. I love to give your credentials because it's such a rainbow of credentials. Taj has a BA degree in poetry and literature from Texas A&M, an MBA in international business from Pepperdine, and studied geopolitical economics at Claremont Graduate University as a PhD. So you have such a broad range of things in your background. I'm excited to kick off this conversation just by asking you, you are one of the early pioneers, and from your background in the intersection of justice and technology and climate, just give us the like human version of how that came to be.
Number one, thank you for inviting me and having me here. And I think it's great. Technology is awesome when it works, and sometimes it's not when it doesn't. But the good thing about that is that it gives us opportunities to fix it. So I'm excited about that. So, audience, if you see a little bit of a delay, blame it on technology and be one of those founders to join Virtue Lab and others to fix it. And so, for me, I think this idea about justice and climate came very quickly. I haven't always been in the climate space. I was a founder and a banker. I was one of those people where environmentalism was in the back of my mind and was not really that important until I started seeing the impacts beyond what we talk about now with global warming, reducing the warming of our world by 1.5 degrees Celsius, but rather I start seeing the weather impacts in my home state of Texas, in the areas that we're focusing on, and in business. And I think those are the things that started really making me think about, well, this idea around climate, this idea around reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is more human than we think. And we have to make sure we're having this wide breadth of that. Also, for me, public health is a huge part of the reduction of greenhouse gases and how they impact you. And for me, being personally impacted, that's one of the things that also made me start thinking about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within the climate space.
So, I mean, this is all super relevant to where you are sitting today, like literally today, right now at the UAE at COP28. Give us a sense of what is happening on the ground. I feel like we get the news a little bit later than it's happening. It's a kind of exciting moment for certainly the global South countries. Tell me what is happening on the ground and what are you engaged in while you're there?
Yeah, I think it's a great feeling. This is the second time in the last 6 months I've been to Dubai and seeing how this young country of 52 years old, they just celebrated their national day, the week the days when COP opened. But I think that there's a bit of excitement, but there's also a bit of concern. People may have been seeing the news around the language that has been used about science, about phasing out versus phasing down. And I think that those are some of the things that have overshadowed some of the wins. And I think even those wins still need have some other things attached to it. So, for example, one of the things I think I'm most excited about as we talk about this idea about justice and equity is a loss and damage fund that's finally funded, that was voted on last COP, and now they have some pledges, over 100 million from the UAE, another 100 million from Germany, 17 million from our country, which we hope can increase. But I think that's a signal to talk about the idea that the things that the global North countries are doing are impacting the global South significantly, and there needs to be some type of climate reparations. The other thing that makes me think about that, because the work that I do is solely based on our U.S. workers, and we want to make sure that over 75 million U.S. workers have access to jobs and skills and reduce the barriers for those. I think the things that happen globally impact us locally. And so that's one of the other reasons I've been really watching a lot of the things here is because there's this idea that when you think about the global South, you think about underdeveloped nations, you think about lack of resources, you think about food insecurity. The reality of it is that we have a bit of that in our own country. There's a bit of the global South within the global North of the United States. And so a lot of the strategies that we're seeing for the global South, I think are going to be relevant for the global South within the USA. And I think what's also exciting here, I spent most of my time on the tech and innovation side. So a lot of us as investors, a lot of founders, there's a lot of excitement specifically in the US where policy has been really forward to helping these founders and providing funding and providing access for them to carry out their technologies. And so I think that's been exciting as well. And the numbers are great. There are over 400,000 people that is in the green zone alone, and a number of different countries that have increased their amounts of delegates here. So I'm hoping that we'll have more wins out of this event, and that we'll have more opportunities to be more collaborative globally. Because for me, we can't just solve the climate crisis in the United States and think we're done. We can't just solve it in Germany or France and think we're done. It has to be a worldwide effort, and that's why I think that this collaboration that's been happening is going to be important.
Yeah. Can you just, for the folks who don't know what the loss of damage fund actually means, like elaborate a little bit on like what is that and like is it debt, is it grants, like what is it exactly and who benefits from it?
Yeah, that's a perfect question. So, from a general standpoint, and I use the phrase reparations, one can think of it that way, that the countries that have not had the greatest emissions of greenhouse gases but are suffering, they're looking at the countries who do have the greatest emissions and are benefiting and have benefited from those productions that they've done to cause these things and cause the bad weather. And so this fund that was announced last COP talked about having the more developed nations, the global north, focus on providing capital to the global south in order to do adaptation or do mitigation on this space. The interesting thing here, like I mentioned, there's been some pledges towards it finally, but the problem also there is that again, it's in a debt standpoint. And any student of history can think about countries such as Haiti and France to think about how debt has marred a number of different countries. And so I think you're going to start seeing some calls to make that funding more grant-like. I think also too, there's been some concern about the administration of the capital, utilizing the World Bank, who has not had a really great reputation in some countries that have been impacted. And so I think that those are the things that we're going to see. And my hope is that once the conference is over, we still have a few more days. There are opportunities to really kind of hammer that out. I would love to point a person back to the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, who gave a really passionate speech and really laid it out on why it's needed and why it should come. And I think in this era that we're in, where the fog of war is happening with so many different places, I think it's interesting that there's a lyric by the great poet Tupac that I think has been um, promoted here, just in small circles, that we have money for bombs and wars, but we don't have money to feed the poor. And basically, that's what we've been saying. And I think there's enough people out here who are feeling that way that I think is going to change. And I think we'll have some movement on there as long as the voices that are for it continue to have that push.
So you bring up Tupac, which brings me to a question I'm just dying to ask you. So I know that you've been called the DJ Khaled of climate. I know that you have a reputation of bringing the style and the swagger to climate. So I just want to address that for a second. Um, I know it's partly because you're hands down the flyest dude in the space. But I remember when I met you in New York for the first time at Climate Week, I was like, who is that dude? Like, how was he in Climate? And I remember you were telling me about how your hats were made. And it was just the coolest thing ever for me to come back. By the way, after living 5 years in Germany, to come back and see folks that look like me, looking fly, doing the work. So it's very exciting. It was very much a moment for me to reflect on like how we as people of color, as Black folks, can really participate in the way that we do, let's say. But I want to kind of dig into this. I know you have a kind of thesis around the role that culture plays into advocating for climate solutions and awareness, and how all the kind of music and fashion and all those kinds of things actually play in meaningfully into this conversation. Tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely, and it's an honor to be called that by the first flash person in climate, you. So I love it. Um, I think overall, and I talk to a lot of people about the things that I put on my body, and I think when we talk about climate, is both what we put inside of our bodies, what we're eating, how the food is grown. Why a lot of us are going to more flexitarian diets or more vegan or vegetarian diets as well. But it's also about the things we put on our bodies, and the audience has to remember apparel accounts for more greenhouse gas emissions than aviation and shipping combined. And so that's one thing to think about when we do it. And some people often ask, well, why is that? Well, I often, again, look to history and say, look to your grandparents and see how many clothes they had versus how many you have. Look to your grandparents and see long they kept their clothes and how long that you didn't keep yours. And so I think that's one thing. But ultimately, the reason I look the way I look, I should say, is authenticity. I think we need that in the climate space. We need this authenticity to talk about the issues that we're doing. Because one of the things I'm really about is that we have to build a bigger, wider tent of people who understand the climate risk, of people who understand the solutions that are coming, of people who understand why the LDW is important, of people who understand what a just transition truly means. And so often when I'm in these conversations, my goal is to try to bring people in this talk who have not been historically here, and I think that's important. And so when we talk about this idea of culture, music, fashion, film, and the climate conversation, I think it makes it more palatable for people to understand the impacts of it. It wasn't that long ago when a great artist called Marvin Gaye had a song called Mercy, Mercy Me. They talked about his idea during the 70s of what was happening from an environmental standpoint. Further, it wasn't too long ago by a poet by the name of Childish Gambino also had a song called "Feels Like Summer," where he alluded to the water insecurity that we may have and other things that are happening on this earth. And so I think songs, music, culture plays a huge part into this idea of awareness, but it can also play a huge part into this idea of solutions. And the reason I say that is because we talk a lot about the word BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And I often fail to see a number of the indigenous communities engaged in these conversations and also allowing the indigenous communities to look at some of the solutions that they've had for years already to heal this land, to heal themselves, and maybe even heal us. And so I think that that's for me what culture comes in at. It comes in as adaptation to ensure that we're building solutions that are adaptable to certain cultures in certain countries. And so I think those things are important. And I think how we look and how we present ourselves is but a symbol. What's interesting for me is most people may see me and they'll see the hat, so they immediately know. But that also gives me a number opportunity to have this conversation with them about climate, about the solutions, about how to truly make it a just transition, but not just for a few of us, but just truly for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I was listening to, and I listen to a Rev Yearwood's podcast often just to kind of reflect on his perspective and some of the folks that he interviews around how do we engage the conversation around climate in communities where climate is not top of mind. Climate, in some ways, as we talk about it, is a very elite conversation. And his thing is right along with where you're at is how can we engage folks who are cultural leaders who we look up to, who are in the communities, in the conversation around climate in a way that hits. And I think that's one topic I would just love to just dip into real quick here is that I'm obviously part of a broader group of folks who come to this work more from that side of the technology. And I started in tech and then I moved into climate tech, but there's lots of folks out there who can benefit from just having this world be more accessible. And I know that's part of what you're thinking. I'm just curious, like, what is it about our communication around climate that makes it so hard for people to engage outside of the elite halls of technology?
Absolutely. As a former founder myself, as a person who has a scientific background, I often used to say to my colleagues and to the fund firms that I invested in is that follow the 8 and 80 rule. And forgive me, those of us who are seasoned over the age of 80. But what I want to say this is that we have to make our technologies understandable where an 8-year-old can understand or 80-year-old can understand. And I think a lot of times we fail to do that in climate. We fail to be more inclusive about the language that we're using. One of the ways I think about this is that there's this idea that some of us may know, some of the listeners and viewers may know. It's called code switching, where we talk a certain way at home amongst our friends that may be different from others, be it whether it's you using Spanish at home, whether you're losing your language of your culture at home, or you're using words that mean certain things at home, and you're using different when you go out, when you work in the workplace. I say that because perhaps we need a climate code switch where when we are around those of us in the climate space, we're talking about this in the way that we know, but when we get out of that bubble, we talk about it differently so that way we can have this adoption and have this awareness that can support. For me, it's simple. The more people that are aware of these issues, the more those people can drive their local politicians, their state politicians, and their national politicians on action, on action that they know and they can believe. And for me, I think that's extremely important to have that because we can't solve this just with technology. Like I love the fact that we're in a space to where we get to think about solutions every day, and as an investor, we get to fund them. But I think we're going to need the policy aspect of it. We're going to need the technology aspect of it. We're going to need all of these things that are coming together in order to push it forward and move the needle forward. And I think when we're talking about this idea of language, I'm often thinking about this book called Words That Work by this guy named Frank Luntz, who's in the political space. And basically, what I think about when he does this work is we have to use incentive words, incentification. So, give you a perfect example. When I'm in the South, I don't use the word green. I don't use the word climate. I simply talk about the outcomes, whether that's wealth that's being built via the jobs, via the investment, whether that is saving your wealth because people are more healthier through public health. And so I think that's one of the ways we need to look at it is look at it from the incentivized standpoint of that audience and talk about it as such.
Mhm. So one thing that I want to dive into, and I'm not sure if I'm sensing that there's maybe a bigger delay than we had before, but maybe not. I'll just keep going unless someone tells me otherwise. Um, so one thing I wanted to dive into is you talk about when you're in a particular place, you think about the language and you maybe you code switch and you think about that. So I want to talk about that with regards to climate and building out climate solutions, building out communication. So you're obviously one of the key pillars in establishing LACI, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, as it is today. And I'm going to be honest, like that was one of my inspirations for how I think about growing a local place-based or regional organization for climate, which is to say, we look around, we see what the issues are that all the different communities are facing, and we try to think about how can we serve that community through innovation, through technology, through climate. I want to learn a little bit more about, like, it's really inspirational to me because you were a longtime Angelino. You dug down in a geographic region. You've been responsible for lifting up a lot of people through the work that you did there, which is obviously continued on. I'd like to know a little bit about how you came into creating that model and some of the successes that have come out of it, because I really think it serves as a beacon for those of us building these regional ecosystems.
Yeah, great question. I would say before Lacey, there was the University of California, and I established their accelerator in Riverside, California. And I chose that. I've worked with the UC system for years at UCLA, did some observation and what have you at UC Davis, where I began to meet my partner, would include Ventures, Bahia Robinson. But the reason I chose University of California, Riverside is because it was heavily Latino, heavily Black, a number of indigenous communities that were there. And we ended up making that community the number four place in the nation for entrepreneurship. And the reason that we were able to do that is we understood this idea of inclusive of selection, because we did not just fund the ideas coming from the university. We focused on the community as well. So I think that was important. So when I got to Lacey, Matt Peterson came a year before me. So he actually laid a lot of the groundwork of what we see with Lacey today, which is a strong political backing, accelerator, and incubator. When I came, my focus was solely on the financing to ensure that our companies at Lacey had the fuel to grow. And for me, what I try to do also is I look at everything from a music standpoint. And I may have mentioned this before, where I look at the founder as an artist. They produce items to give to their stakeholders. But those artists also need labels to help finance them. And that's why I look at financing companies, PE companies, VC companies, angels as those record labels. And then lastly, they need amplifiers like Spotify or SoundCloud. And that's where accelerators and incubators come into the play. And so for me, I looked at that in that way, and I tried to elevate each part of that and make sure that we were the Spotify climate founders. And from that, I think what also was important was the diversity of Lacey increased, and I think that was very important. So people could see themselves in the people who were helping them, and I think that's important. And diversity is more than just the color, but it's also the authenticity. Going back to that phrase of who's actually making the decisions and who's there and who can help. Ironically, and I think not ironically, but it just shows that diversity is important. two of the most successful companies to come out of Lacey since my tenure there and after I left were Spark Charge and Charger Help, two companies led by two Black Americans. Charger Help, based in South Central Los Angeles, focuses on the transportation space of really kind of training and workforce side of ensuring that there's reliability within the charging infrastructure. Because we move more towards electric vehicles, we need to make sure that grid management is secure, but also
Mhm.
that the charging infrastructure is secure. So that's very
Mhm.
important. And I think along those lines, Spark Charge the same way. Another company originally based and started in Buffalo, New York, now based in Boston, and expanded to California. And came to
Mhm.
California, we recruited that company. Those are two great examples. And the reason
Mhm.
for us why transportation is important is if you've ever been to Los Angeles, you would know that traffic is traffic. And so we have the World Cup, we have the Olympics. So we want to make sure that the infrastructure from a traffic standpoint and from a transportation standpoint is key. And I'm so
Mhm.
proud of the work that the team, Matt, and the rest of the team will continue to do now to really be the beacon around this idea of Los Angeles and sustainability. But I think the core of that is digging into the community, not telling them what the community wants, but actually having the community be a part of the solution and a part of the creation of the solution as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I really want to dig in a little bit more. Like, I think so. I was going to bring up Charger Help because I know that's a huge, that's such a runaway success in the region, and obviously now nationally. And one of the things that I struggle with, and you're a funder as well, is that typically when solutions come up for communities that are viable, um, they might be regarded as less novel and less innovative than I invented nuclear fusion, right? And I want to address this question around business innovation and around the different tiers of innovation, if you will, because I have this burning desire to decolonize climate tech innovation in the sense that really, like, good ideas can come from anywhere, right? But we do tier them, especially when we're thinking about venture funding, based upon what we think their kind of role in the innovation ecosystem actually is. Is there a space for this kind of business innovation, especially the one that's community facing? And how can we break, let's say, the stigma around that to make it a more like core part of how we think about who we fund?
I love that question because literally that came up today on a panel that I was on. And I do believe that when we talk about this idea of diversity in the solutions, there also need to be diversity in who's writing the check and why they're writing the check. And I think that's important because I think that if we really want to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, if we really want to focus all of our energy on ensuring that we're going to meet these goals, then everything matters. Every little drop matters, whether it's focusing on the community level, whether it's focusing on a less national, larger level, whether it's dealing with nuclear fusion, whether it's dealing with adaptation for communities that are already impacted by climate change. We need it all. And I think there's enough capital to go around from at least from the venture side of it to fund those things. The problem I think historically is that it's been very homogeneous in the climate space, extremely. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that my partners and I decided early on to do a fund of funds that focused on diversity, both from a regional standpoint, a geographic standpoint, and a person standpoint as well. Because I think that when people tend to think about diversity, they don't thinking about the surface, which is, oh, I'll just have a black person check the box. I have a brown person check the box. I have a woman check the box. The real power of diversity is that those individuals that you're checking the box of, they're going to come with different visions, different ideas to achieve the same goal. And I think that's the power and the need for diversity. And I
Mhm.
think to your point, what needs to change is the LPs, the allocators, the reason why they're funding. And I think that's going to be different. I look at it in a perfect example. There's a company that I met recently that was building electric bicycles, electric motorbikes. And when we think about that in the United States, it's more of a novelty for people who are making a two wheeler. But when you think about other parts of the world, that's the global majority. That may be the global South, but they are the global majority. The Caribbean, parts of Africa, India, China. Two wheelers are more than just recreational vehicles. There are taxis. There are vehicles of choice to get around in those communities. their vehicles of choice to go to and from work to make an income and a living. And so I
Mhm.
think that capital community, and what I'm hoping is that we're going to start seeing, again, more of a global look on the solutions that we're providing. And, I don't think that we need, like, we're not an impact fund. And I don't think that's only on the shoulders of impact funds to make these things work. But what I do believe is that we have to make impactful investments. We have
Mhm.
to make investments that are intentional, and we have to
Mhm.
make sure that we're doing things the way, and that
Mhm.
we're also thinking about this idea of true just transition. So, as another example, as we're moving everything towards electric vehicles, we have to think about the components of batteries that power these vehicles. We have
Mhm.
to think about the artisanal mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So for me, it's like we're going to have a just transition in the United States, but it's going to be unjust for the people on the continent of Africa and Congo and many other places. And so I
Mhm.
think also that's why this worldwide view is important of
Mhm.
having these global mindsets of those of us who lived in other countries, of those of us who've seen other things, of those of us who are children of people who are immigrants. I think those types of individuals come into the place, but also make those things change. And then lastly, there's a quote I think a number of us in investment space know, and maybe your audience has heard before, but talent is universal and opportunity is not. And I think that that's one of the driving forces to think about how we should think about climate, the solutions, and funding. Lastly, I
Mhm.
would say, though, what I'm excited about is that there are other opportunities that are happening. We're seeing more project financing that are happening in addition to venture. We're seeing more rise of venture groups. We're seeing more companies utilize different forms of capital and super angels coming. We're also seeing funds, private equity funds, come down and invest in earlier companies than they historically have, such as
Yeah.
Ares Climate Innovation Fund. We're seeing a lot of those things happening on the diverse of financing side, the diverse
Yes.
of technology side, diversity of people side.
Yeah, so that's great, and that leads me to the next. I don't want to get too inside baseball on the funding side, but I will say that one of the things that's happening right now. So I sit on the board, the community advisory board of the Candide's new fund, the Afterglow Fund, and we've been looking at deals across the country for this kind of historically different, and maybe of a predecessor to this catalytic debt fund. And we're looking at where we scale projects where traditional finance is not available to support these organizations. And sometimes because of, again, I'll try not to get too inside baseball here, because of the tax credit opportunities that are opening up for nonprofits, um, there is now a need to sort of like, forward fund some activities that some nonprofits are doing. So what might not have traditionally looked like a business now kind of looks like a business if you're a local energy developer that happens to be a nonprofit that doesn't fit into the exact. So, I mean, they're not going to be venture funded. They're not going to have access to some of the funds that have traditionally been out there. So, this challenge is now calling on us to do so many different kinds of funding and to think about our vehicles. Tell me a little bit about where you see some of the opportunities emerging in the funding landscape and where we might be able to double down. So I ask you this as an LP, as a fund manager, as someone who's seen a lot of things come and go, a lot of financial instruments come and go over the last decades.
Yeah, great question, and I love it. And I'm here smiling because I remember SPACs in the early '90s, and they reemerged here. And some people may have thought they knew, but they've been around for a while. And they were the first bit of excitement in the 2021, 22, and then kind of fizzled out when we realized that mispriced assets matter. But I think what I'm excited about is things like Candide's Fund, and bravo to Anir and the team for building that, and people like you and Michael Hawthorne on the advisory board to move things forward. But I do think, as I mentioned, around project finance, as around debt, there's going to be a lot of opportunities in differentiated capital. As a founder, and I'm a former banker myself, one of the things I thought about is that when I was a founder was that debt sometimes is cheaper than equity and could be activated faster than equity. And further, to meet our goals around climate, there needs to be emphasis not just on software, but hardware, where a lot of the debt could really kind of be beneficial and efficient. And so I think that what's exciting right now is that you have a lot of opportunity for people with different types of ideas of things to grow. to
Mhm.
move it forward. One of the things I've always said is that venture is not the only way. If you're building a bus and you're building a jet, and if you look at venture's jet fuel, it might not be appropriate for a bus, but it may be appropriate for the jet. But
Mhm.
both of those things are going forward and taking this person from one place to the next. And,
Mhm.
and I think that's one of the ways I look at this idea of what's rapidly changing about what's investable,
Mhm.
what is a business. I remember we used to use this word lifestyle business for a lot
Mhm.
of some of these ideas that people had. And
Mhm.
I think of this idea of if there's a market, if there's a person for it, if there's an opportunity to scale, there could be some different type of capital for it. But I think what's interesting and what I love about it is that there are a lot of young people who are coming into the venture space who are really thinking about new ways of funding. There are also a lot of people within organizations. Some include like Marilyn Waite, who was formerly at Hewlett and now at the Climate Finance Fund, who are thinking about this idea of differentiated finance from a global perspective, with her sitting in Europe, but also
Mhm.
having her hands in the US and China, and really kind of focusing on this bilateral, trilateral type of funding opportunity. And
Mhm.
I think what's also exciting is that a lot of founders, um, a lot of founders here from the US. They're thinking earlier about exposure globally, and they're thinking earlier about how to have this exposure and do it properly, but also looking at funding in different areas.
Mhm.
Companies here like Clover, based in Atlanta, Georgia, that's looking at the energy space. Companies like Kidget, that's based in Los Angeles, that's looking at the manufacturing EVSC space. And so I think that's one of the other exciting things about that is that we're finally realizing that this is an issue that we have to tackle globally. And there's
Mhm.
an old African proverb that says, many hands make light work. And I think those many hands are coming from different types of ideas around financing,
Mhm.
different types of ideas around solutions, and different types of ideas around debt to push
Yeah.
things forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and one last little bit about the funding side. So we at Virtue Lab have had an early stage catalytic venture climate venture fund, and so a lot of our LPs are actually philanthropies, and so it might be through a PRI or a DAF or however they're getting, however they're thinking about their contribution impact wise into the climate space. So this is a very specific area, right? But what conversations I'm having with philanthropists right now is suggesting to me that philanthropy is having to change to serve this moment. In terms of the old school was like, let's give these hungry African children some food, and now it's having to be a more active entrepreneurial conversation around like how do we stimulate the opportunities for agriculture, the mitigation, like how do we do adaptation around food. Like it's become a very different conversation than what it was at one time. And I know that I believe that in your role, you are very much intersecting with philanthropists. What's the conversation that you're seeing in philanthropy, and how is it having an impact on this, let's say, the finance stack and the opportunities that are out there?
Absolutely. This is, the first thing I would say, there's this book. If the folks are watching this, if you're really into books, I gave you one with Frank Luntz. I'm going to give you another one with a great economist, fellow economist named Dambisa Moyo, called Dead Aid. And she talks about this idea of aid coming to the continent and many different countries of Africa. And it's dead on arrival because it's not really thought through. But I want to talk about some of the philanthropies and corporations that are doing it right. And I'll start with Aries. Aries funded through their charitable foundation funding to think about the intersection of climate and workforce. Because I think what was happening is that as those of us in the investment space, them included, we were making these investments into climate companies, and those companies were growing and are scaling, and they need jobs, and they're creating jobs, and they need the talent. That pipeline was becoming shorter and shorter because we were having a lack of skilled labor in some of these areas. And so, kind of thinking forward, I think that's a perfect example of how philanthropy is moving ahead of the issue and trying to find out ways to partner. So, Aries Charitable Foundation provided capital to both Jobs for the Future and World Resources Institute in India, and looked at both India and the US and this idea of building climate resilient employees for a sustainable tomorrow. And here in the US, what we're looking about is how can we create and train 25,000 people in these jobs, train and place these people in these jobs. But secondly, and it goes back to what we talked about around music, around culture, is the awareness piece of that. How can we make sure that people are aware of these type of jobs that are available, that are coming? And I think one of the things we have to think about is that, and it hasn't been said, I don't think, is that this idea around climate, this idea around solutions, we're going to have some behavioral changes. The things that we used to do, we're not going to be able to do as humans, as venture capital companies, as startups, as a lot of things. And so there's going to be a lot of behavioral changes. And as you mentioned, I think the philanthropic side is going through behavioral changes as well. These are some of the conversations that's been had at conferences such as Confluence Philanthropy around the role of family offices, around foundations, and how can they be more catalytic. The work that we did at the Consumer Guarantee Pool, to Consumer Investment Guarantee Pool that you mentioned, where I served on the board last year, is how can we help those organizations think about ways to be more catalytic in their funding and think about things differently. Some other specific examples, and I mentioned Marilyn Wade from the funding side. She funded us on 2 years ago to think about how can we have more diverse funds that are looking at thinking about climate differently in both the U.S. and Europe. And the normal way would say, let me be an LP in your fund. But many of us who are in the fund space realize there are a lot of costs and a lot of expensive costs in raising a fund. And
Mhm.
so providing capital to offset that, GP forgivable grants are great ways to really try to increase the types of people who are in the space who think about things differently, who may think adaptation is a greater choice or equal choice to mitigation, who may
Mhm.
think that investing in the global south is profitable and beneficial. And so I think that there's a lot of examples of these, private equity funds, of these philanthropies, of these organizations that are thinking about how can we really be a contributor to the space, and how
Mhm.
can we think about things differently. And further, last thing I would say though too is that I think a lot of the decisions that we're making are good decisions, and we have to think about some things may work, some things may not. But
Mhm.
as the culture of technology, that is the culture of innovation, and that is the culture of the capital space that we're in, to try and fail and try again, but do it faster because we're dealing with a climate issue.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit to an area that I think is really just like important because I have you here. And when I first got offered the job, I accepted the job at Virtue App. I think I messaged you and I said, "Hey Taj, is there anyone else here out here like me? Anyone you know?" And then you were like, "Hold on, let me check." And then you went back and you were like, "Nope, nope, it's just you. It's just you." And so just this idea of me as a black woman leading an incubator and fund. Um, I mean, honestly, I still haven't found one globally yet, but you did point me to some other women of color in the space. And I had to take a moment of reflection. I was like, I figured if there was anyone out there you would know. And that's why I hit you up first. And I had to take this moment of reflection where I was like, okay, I'm trying not to be stressed out about the fact that I might be alone here. And I thought to myself, first of all, it is so key the role we play as leaders, especially those of us who are visibly different from all the other folks and who think more broadly about how communities are impacted by the climate crisis. I just want to ask you, because I've thought about this a lot, what is our responsibility as leaders in the climate space? And by us, I mean those of us who are few in the mix and who are overshadowed by previous agendas and folks that have been mainstream. And what is it that what is our responsibility? Because I still haven't figured it out yet, but I want to know.
I love it. I love that question because the answer to the question to me includes these names: Wawa Gatheru, Sophia Kiani, Christy Drutman, Nika Kubule, Af Hernandez. These are people I know and love that for me, as a person who's been in this space for a while, it is about succession. It is about making sure that we bust open the door, bust open the ceiling with that one hand, but we take this other hand and we make sure we reach back to pull people up with us, to make sure that there's more people who have these opportunities like we do. So that way, when we look around the next time, we're not alone and there are other people there. And again, some people may hear these things and may think it's only about the fact that we are people of color. But no, the reason about this is that we're coming with a different type of energy. We're coming with a different type of mindset. And we're having this opportunity to say, these are ways to do things differently. And so I think that that's, for me, secession is a huge part of it, of ensuring that you're highlighting. I mentioned NECA. NECA works at Align Climate Capital, another investor in this space, and she has this idea around green tech noir during the pandemic. And the idea was, to your point, we wanted people in the space to not feel alone. We wanted to build a sense of community. Kerry Bowie, who's on the East Coast, created an organization called Brown in the Green Space, similar to that as well, working with a lot of folks on that side of the country. And I think that those things are important because it allows us to think about each other, and allows us to have this group of people that can come through and that can um, be those resources that come off the bench, if you will, to these other opportunities. And so
Mhm.
I'm really excited about this idea of cultivating the next generation quickly and really kind of continue to do the work, because I think that's a huge part of our role. And maybe my role as a person that's, nearing 50, Generation X. Um, you know, we, we were one of the last generations to be left home alone. So we're kind of okay with being solo. But I think that's a huge part of the things we need to do. Because I think a lot of times when we think about those of us of color, there's a lot less of secession when we think about our politics. When we think about our
Mhm.
politicians. We have true secession of creating the next generation of politicians that come up in an orderly
Mhm.
fashion. And I think those of
Mhm.
us in the tech and investment community, we can do it. We can have this idea of creating the next generation while we're still doing the work and while we're still impactful. Because I think
Mhm.
one of the other things about it too is that because there's these existing relationships, it becomes more collaborative and more
Mhm.
effective. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's the I'm really interested about is ensuring that the next generation, from the millennials to the Gen Zs to the Gen Alphas or whatever may come after that, they have these pathways to ensure that they're protected, they are
Mhm.
encouraged. And there's this idea that we talk, and again, we're going to use code switching. Some people may have heard of people saying, "I'm giving you the game," but what that means for us is guidance, attention, motivation, and encouragement. So that's the
Mhm.
game I want to give to the young people coming into the climate space.
Yeah. I'm so on this, just one touch on one other leadership thing, which I think is also a broader question. So there's what we need to do, right? And I think sometimes it feels like a heavy load to have to carry when you're not a lot of people. But I also want to shift this question to the broader leadership community, meaning whether you're a climate leader, but not even so much that, but a business leader, a political leader, an entertainment leader. What is the mindset shift that needs to happen for those folks who are not directly in climate, but who are leaders in the world, to really be accepting the assignment and handling it? What is that? What is that conversation that needs to be had?
Yeah, great question. And I'd say from personal experience, and it's interesting, it was talked about here at COP by Secretary Clinton, and I think it rings true. Excitement will get you in the door. Flashiness, look and fly like we do, would get you noticed. But will make you stay and make you respected as knowledge and understanding, and having the skills to understand the space that you're in, whether it's climate, whether it's climate finance, whether it's engineering, whether it's AI, what have you. There is this idea, for me, that I think about is that you never stop learning until you leave this earth. So there's an opportunity for us to continue to add to our arsenal of knowledge. And I think that that's what makes one part of a good leader, is having that knowledge to move things forward. The second part that I think is often missed, and this is this idea of the emotional intelligence piece of that, is empathy, caring, and this human idea, I think is important. And sometimes that falls by the wayside. And I think that's extremely important as a leader, to be able to cultivate these relationships, to build these bridges. Because I think that's, again, important. I already talked about the solutions that we need to have, whether it's climate or any other business. Collaboration is key. And so I think as leaders, the knowledge is important, but also this humanistic quality is important as well, to be able to connect, to be able to influence, and to be able to guide. Again, give an idea about guidance, attention, motivation, and encouragement. I think
Mm,
those things are important for leaders. But again, primarily, you have to know what you're doing and what you're talking about, and
mhm,
you have to be available to understand that you might fail, and transparency about it.
mm,
When I was sick, I was very transparent about my health and the journey I was going through because number one, I felt like as a leader, there could be other people facing the same things quietly as I am. And I
mm,
wanted to be upfront about it. And then as an investor, sometimes your health, not all, sometimes, oftentimes, your health is a risk component. And so for me, being very upfront, being very open about it was also not only a release for me, but also it enabled me to connect with so many other people who were in the same position that I never knew. And I
mhm,
think those are some of the things that we have to think about as leaders: this idea of transparency, this
mhm,
idea of connection, this idea of knowledge.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm always banging on to my team about the work of Maria Mazzucato, Mission Economy. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's one of my favorites, and I really love how she talks about this idea of, she uses the getting, a rocket to the moon, a man on the moon, as like this core mission that everyone committed to, and you needed experts from all these different areas and a very high level of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector in order to launch this thing by X date. And it was one of the most expensive missions anyone had ever endeavored to achieve, right? And I always think about that as this bigger challenge around like, what is the role we all play in building that rocket? What is the role we play in making sure that we use our area of expertise to come to the table and contribute to that? And I think one of the things that's most challenging about climate tech is that we are not all just playing for ourselves. We're playing for this mission. We're playing for making sure that rocket makes it to where it needs to go. And I wonder if you can just speak to a little bit around how the mindset differs. Because for me as a tech entrepreneur, it's taken a shift, right? It's not just about me having a unicorn. It's about this kind of double, triple benefit of that what I'm building is connected to what other people are building. I mean, what is your kind of like your thought around this? You brought up collaboration, like about how we think about climate tech differently than how we think about other technology because of this interconnectivity issue.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, when I was a founder, and I wasn't a founder in the climate space, I was in the fashion space, in the mobile space. But I think climate is much more different because there are a lot of things that are at stake, as you mentioned, with the work that we're doing, with the investments, with the technologies. And I love what you mentioned from the book that said about, again, for me, those two things that you said from the book, things about two areas for me: collaboration and diversity. Diversity of ideas, diversity of skills, diversity of coming to the table with something that's needed to fit into this puzzle of moving things forward. And I think that's, to me, that's what is exciting as an investor about climate tech, is that we have the opportunity to not only provide a return, because there is an opportunity to build green wealth. We've seen it. But there's also an opportunity to have these innovations really kind of save humanity. And I think that puts it on a bigger level. And I think for me, it's important to have that mindset because I often talk about this idea of there are return on investments from a quarterly standpoint, from an annual standpoint. And I've mentioned so many times that I tend to like to look at it personally from an ancestral standpoint. I want to make ancestral returns because I want to make sure the work I'm doing today is going to benefit not just my children and my grandchildren, but thankfully or hopefully, if they do have some, the generations after me. And I will be someone's ancestor that will say that I did what I can on this earth to make sure that their lives were different and their lives were saved and their lives were sacred. And so I think that's the beauty of the space that we're in climate, is that we tend to utilize this idea. There's this Japanese phrase, and I'm trying to think of it. And I think if anybody there is Japanese, they may correct me, but I think it's EKG, where it's the combination of what you do, what you're good at, what the world needs. And I think that Venn diagram type of idea is so evident within climate because it's
Yeah.
combining the idea of what we have, what we can do, and how we can really kind of benefit the world. And lastly, I would say that when we talk about benefiting the world, we tend to forget sometimes, and I think some of us tend to forget, we're saving the world for humanity. And so a lot of times too, I think that the benefit of diversity in the climate space is that there are some of us who come from it from a different standpoint who may say, like me, that we have to think about the human element in this space. We have to think about just transition for everyone. Because what we don't want to have is unintended consequences that we just mentioned around electric vehicles and the battery situation.
Mhm.
But I also see the battery situation as an opportunity because
Mhm.
now I can guarantee you there's some founder somewhere in Oregon, in Seattle, in Los Angeles that are saying that issue around artisanal mines in the Congo and extraction in the United States on Native American or indigenous land, there needs to be a solution for that. Let me think about battery refurbishment. Let me think about these other items that can fuel things as well. And I think the role of capital in this space and the role of us as investors and accelerators and incubators is help accelerate that faster, to bring
Mhm.
that to market faster, because we're going to need these ideas and these technologies to market faster to reduce what science tells us is happening, that the world is no longer warming, is it boiling, and we need to make sure we correct those issues.
Yeah. So I have one question that came up in the chat that I'll just ask before we close, and then I just have one last one for you. So this is from Reggie. I love Reggie. Reggie's out in Atlanta. Reggie Parker, and he runs a fund, I believe, and a really exciting program that does HBCU renewables work. So I don't know where we met. Where we met, maybe we met online. In a conversation last week, he says a utility shared that 80% of what we need to address in climate already exists, but we need to invest in hard tech for the future to meet the other 20%. He shared we need better solar, wind, hydro, and storage. How can we get investors interested in hard tech, even solar again?
Absolutely, and shout out to Reggie Parker who built Green Power Ventures and Optimal Tech there and done work. And he's a perfect example of a founder who understands the global lens with the solutions that he's done for Bermuda, as an example, and the work he's done also in Ghana and Kenya. And so I think there's this phrase we used to say that hard tech is hard, but there's also a book by Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz that says the hard things about hard things. I think to me, that's why Reg is a perfect example of a founder who was in the hard tech space that saw the issues that ended up becoming an investor in this space because he wanted to also fund and help other founders who look like him, who are hard tech founders that needed this capital. And I think that, I used to joke and say, I've been in clean tech so long, I remember when it was a dirty word. And post Solyndra, there was no one checking for climate. It was a very lonely space. But in 2020, right at the top of the pandemic, we started seeing more funding, more funds come into it. Then we start seeing more policies around it from our federal government. And now climate is the technology du jour along with AI. But I think that the good thing about that is that there are a number again of people who are thinking about how can we use again the other types of capital beyond venture capital that may be more appropriate for hard tech. How can we use the debt piece of that? How can other forms of capital come into space? But I think that the key to that is again market demand and ensuring that people are aware of these technologies. We talked about earlier about this idea of music and culture, and I sit on the board of an organization called Clean Energy Culture, also
Mhm.
based in Atlanta,
Yeah,
Little K and Culture K, and they're
yeah.
at the intersection of climate and music, where they have a world-renowned DJ as one of the co-founders, who are getting artists that he produced and he works with to get into the climate space and kind of revisit. For those of us who may remember the Red Hot organization, the Red Hot music series that did benefits for AIDS awareness. And so
Yeah.
I think things like that and things like different types of capital coming into space would allow for hard tech companies to be front and center, like Reggie, like Paul Francis, I mentioned, and so many others.
Mhm. So we have 60 seconds. I'm going to quick fire you one, two last questions. When you think about the space right now, what gives you most optimism? What gives you the most worry?
Great. The thing that gives me the most optimism is the type of people who are coming to the space. They're coming and they're coming hard. They're coming and they're not waiting. They have little patience, but they're really studying and going back to the idea around studying more, understanding to complement that passion. And I think that's phenomenal. What worries me is that the lack of urgency and a lot of times, sometimes the lack of understanding the language and being hung up on the language as opposed to the action.
Mhm.
For me, I think that there's this phrase we used to use back in the 80s called the gateway drug. And
Mhm.
I want us to have a gateway drug towards climate solutions. And for me, what that means is that if you're in the South and you don't believe in climate, but you're working at a company that's doing sustainable work or that's doing work that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but you just don't want to hear the word climate, I don't care. I don't care if you call it whatever you call it. What I care about is you're doing the work whether you know it or not. And it goes back to this idea of how policy has been created that maybe people don't think about, but it may be in the best interest, and they move forward. And so the challenges for me is ensuring that we build this big tent, we do it properly, and we create language so other people can get into space and benefit from what all of us are building.
I love it. Thank you so much, Taj. I know it is like past midnight over there. Really appreciate you. Thank you for joining. And I know people are going to love this conversation. It will live longer on LinkedIn. So thanks again.
Thank you all. Thank you, Virtual Lab. Been a pleasure. Have a great evening and a great day, everyone.
All right. Safe travels back.
Bye bye.